They were called the families. They lived by a code older than the country itself, and for nearly a century, they ran America from the shadows. Every week, we open the files on the men who built the underworld, the bosses, the wars, the rituals, the betrayals, the blood oaths that bound them, and the secrets they swore to take to the grave. Subscribe. Some stories were never meant to be told.
Mafia Dynasty, The Rise and Fall of Gotti and the Colombos. Get a year. Gonna put this thing together where they could never break it, never destroy it. Even if we die, be a good thing. These were the words of a man obsessed with his own myth, recorded secretly in the back of a Queen social club. But as one empire was being forged in blood and ego, another was tearing itself apart from the inside. Welcome to a world of shattered loyalties and the desperate quest for a mafia dynasty. In the early 1990s, the Colombo family was a slaughterhouse. Carmen the Snake Persico, ruling from a prison cell in California where he spent his days cultivating a rose garden, was determined to ensure his son, Alphonse, took the throne. It was a war of succession that turned Brooklyn into a shooting gallery, claiming the lives of teenagers and leaving the family structure in a total shambles. By the time the smoke cleared, more than 70 hierarchy members and associates were behind bars, and the dream of a Persico dynasty was buried under a mountain of RICO convictions. But while the Colombos were bleeding out, a new, flashy king was rising in South Ozone Park. John Gotti, the man the press would soon crown the Dapper Don, was obsessed with leaving a hell of a legacy. Gotti wasn't content with just being a boss, he wanted to create a Borgata that would take 30 years to succumb to the law. The FBI, however, was finally ready to play ball. Agent Bruce Mau and his C-16 squad were starting from scratch, facing a criminal powerhouse of 400 made men. They found their golden ticket in a mobster nicknamed Quack Quack Angelo Ruggiero. Ruggiero's non-stop, loose talk on FBI bugs provided the probable cause the government desperately needed. His obsessive chatter didn't just compromise himself, it laid the groundwork for the feds to bug the mansion of Paul Castellano, the very boss Gotti would eventually execute on a cold December night outside Sparks Steakhouse. But catching Gotti was like trying to grab smoke. The era of the Teflon Don had begun. In 1987, after a grueling RICO trial, a Brooklyn jury returned a verdict of not guilty, and Gotti walked out of the courthouse to a roar of applause. To the public, he was a folk hero, a man who paid for block parties and donated to hospitals. His lawyer, Bruce Cutler, would literally toss the government's indictments into a wastebasket during his opening statements, screaming that they were rotten. Shame on them, the experts whispered as the FBI and multiple prosecutorial offices stumbled over each other, their jurisdictional rivalries allowing Gotti to slip through their fingers time and again. Gotti even beat a state assault charge for the shooting of a union official, John O'Connor, further cementing his image as the man the law couldn't touch. But Gotti's arrogance was his undoing. He moved his headquarters to the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, demanding his capos pay him public homage every week. It was a who's who of the Gambino family, captured daily by FBI cameras from a secret stakeout across the street. The final blow didn't come from the street, it came from a third-floor hallway and a quiet apartment. In a daring black bag job, FBI technicians penetrated the Ravenite building, planting bugs in the rear hallway and eventually inside the living room of an elderly widow named Nettie Cirelli. When Mrs. Cirelli's holiday took her away for Thanksgiving in 1989, the FBI struck. For the first time, investigators heard Gotti's own voice, unfiltered and cold, authorizing murders, bragging about his power, and sealing his own fate. The Teflon was finally about to peel. The rise and fall of the American Mafia. I want to switch governments. With those 5 words, spoken in a secret meeting in October 1991, the foundations of the American Mafia didn't just crack, they shattered. Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, the underboss of the Gambino family and John Gotti's right-hand man, walked away from a lifetime of omerta to become the most high-profile turncoat in history. He confessed to 19 murders, including the spectacular hit on Paul Castellano, and his testimony finally stripped the Teflon off the Dapper Don. But as Gotti was hauled off to spend the rest of his life in a subterranean cell in Marion, Illinois, the victory for law enforcement was far from clean. Behind the scenes, the bitter aftermath revealed a civil war between federal and state agencies, with the FBI accused of hiding tapes that could have exposed a mob mole inside the NYPD. And as for Sammy the Bull, After a hero's welcome into the witness protection program, he couldn't stay away from the life, eventually landing right back behind bars for running a massive ecstasy ring in Arizona. While the Gambino family was being eaten alive by its own, the Dapper Don himself entered a period of self-worship. Even from a prison 1,000 miles away, Gotti attempted to rule his empire through his son, John Jr. Gotti, until his own body surrendered to cancer in 2002. His funeral was a $200,000 spectacle of gold-encrusted bronze and 22 limousines, marking the end of the most publicized mafia reign since Al Capone. But as the Gotti era faded, a far more terrifying figure was emerging from the shadows of Brooklyn, Anthony Gaspipe Casso. The Lucchese family underboss was a man who swapped the flashy suits of Gotti for raw, unadulterated violence. Casso didn't just kill his enemies, he conducted a blood purge that turned his own Borgata into a slaughterhouse. He even had his own mafia cops, 2 decorated NYPD detectives who allegedly served as his personal hit squad, providing him with confidential lists of unmarked surveillance cars and even carrying out contract murders. Casso's paranoia was infectious. In a desperate bid to escape a massive federal indictment, he and boss Vic Amuso went on the lam, attempting to rule their family through a series of public payphones. They left the professor, Al Darko, to manage the carnage on the streets, but their thirst for blood eventually turned on their own captains. The breaking point came when Casso ordered the hit on one of his most loyal capos, Peter "Fat Pete" Chiodo. After surviving 12 bullet wounds, Chiodo realized that in Gaspipe's world, loyalty was a death sentence. Soon after, Darko himself, fearing a setup at a Manhattan hotel, sprinted into the arms of the FBI. The Lucchese hierarchy was collapsing from the top down, victims of the very terror they used to rule. The Code of Omerta. The Code of Omerta was once a sacred, unbreakable bond, a wall of silence that the FBI spent decades trying to scale. But by the early 1990s, that wall wasn't just cracking, it was being demolished by the very man who had sworn to protect it. Welcome to the era of the high-level turncoat, where the mafia's most fearsome warriors traded their honor for a chance to breathe fresh air again. The downfall of Anthony Tumac, etc. Our first stop is the downfall of Anthony Tumac, etc., the legendary Newark powerhouse of the Lucchese family. Etc. was the quintessential man of honor who believed the mafia was a noble society. But when the Lucchese hierarchy, led by the bloodthirsty Anthony Casso, put a contract out not just on Tumac, but on his own wife and son, the old-school Don decided he'd had enough. Tumac's turn came in a prison in Newton, New Jersey, where he renounced a lifetime of loyalty and began handing prosecutors the keys to the Garden State's underworld. The capture of Anthony Gaspipe Casso. While etc. was singing in New Jersey, the most dangerous man in New York was finally brought to heel. Anthony Gaspipe Casso, the Lucchese underboss who ruled through raw, unadulterated terror, was captured in a quiet New Jersey suburb. The feds didn't just want him behind bars, they wanted the secrets of his mafia cops and his 37 murder victims. But Casso was too toxic even for the feds. After he was kicked out of the witness program for continued lies and bribery, a judge handed him a staggering 13 consecutive life sentences, a total of 455 years in the hole. The creation of Team America. This mass exodus of mobsters created a new kind of fraternity, Team America. While Gaspipe rotted, his former captains like Al Darko and Fat Pete Chiodo were being rewarded for their betrayals. Darko, the man who knew where all the Lucchese bodies were buried, didn't serve a single day in prison after helping convict over 50 of his former brothers. The last Don wasn't being taken down by G-men, he was being cannibalized by his own crew. The Masquerade of Vincent Gigante. But as one empire collapsed, another hid in plain sight behind the most elaborate masquerade in criminal history. Step onto Sullivan Street in Greenwich Village, where a stooped, shabbily dressed man shuffles along in a bathrobe and pajamas, muttering to himself. This was Vincent Gigante, the Oddfather. To the public, he was a mental patient who didn't know his own name. To the Genovese family, he was a brilliant, calculating CEO who demanded absolute secrecy. The FBI's psychological warfare. The FBI waged psychological warfare to crack his act. They used masked informers to point fingers on the street and once even caught him standing in a dry bathtub, wearing a bathrobe and holding an open umbrella to avoid their subpoenas. They rented luxury apartments and lay on rooftops for months, watching him count stacks of cash through his mistress's townhouse windows while he pretended to be a drooling lunatic during the day. The truth about Fat Tony Salerno. Law enforcement finally realized they had been played for fools. While the feds had spent years targeting Fat Tony Salerno, the cigar-chomping face of the Genovese family, Salerno was nothing but a decoy, a human shield designed to keep the heat away from the village. The tapes finally told the truth. Salerno himself was recorded admitting, "I'll leave this up to the boss." The real boss was the man in the bathrobe. Vincent Gigante was the commission, the phantom pulling the strings of the most sophisticated, secretive, and powerful criminal organization in America. Corruption and betrayal in the Mafia. We got our money from gambling, but our real power, our real strength, came from the unions. This was the chilling confession of Genovese defector Vincent Fish Caffaro, exposing a billion-dollar engine of corruption that reached into the very pockets of every New Yorker. While the world watched flashy bosses like John Gotti, the Genovese family was quietly bleeding the city dry through the Fulton Fish Market, the Javits Convention Center, and the city's private garbage carting industry. It was a financial juggernaut built on Chin's millions, overseen by the man the FBI called the smartest mafia figure to ever walk the streets, Vincent Chin Gigante. But every fortress has a flaw. For the Genovese family, it began with a mid-level drug hustler named Bobby Ferenga, who woke up in 1987 with an FBI narcotics task force in his bedroom. Facing 20 years in prison, Ferenga offered the feds a trade that would change everything: "I know where bodies are buried." That lead took investigators to a Williamsburg warehouse where they unearthed 2 gangland corpses and stumbled upon a multi-million-dollar fraud known as the Windows case. The architect was a smooth-talking associate named Pete Savino, a man who had replaced the windows at Gigante's own family home. Faced with his own life sentence, Savino walked the razor's edge, wearing a hidden FBI wire into the heart of the Mafia for 20 months. The trap was finally sprung on a May morning in 1990 when the Oddfather was arrested at his mother's apartment, dressed in his trademark bathrobe and pajamas. But the drama didn't end at the arrest. At the trial, a skeletal Savino, ravaged by terminal cancer, delivered his testimony via closed-circuit television from a wheelchair, a final act of betrayal that brought to bay the most elusive boss in history. Yet, Gigante's final act was a last hurrah from behind bars. Even in a federal cell, the faking Don continued to run the Genovese family through his son, Andrew. It took a Rolex watch equipped with a recording device, worn by an informer named Michael Cookie Durso, to finally shatter Gigante's 30-year masquerade of mental illness. Facing overwhelming evidence, the man who once wandered the streets muttering to himself finally stood in a courtroom and admitted it was all an act. As the Genovese empire crumbled, law enforcement turned its sights toward a family the underworld had written off as a joke, the Bonannos. FBI agent Jack Stubing knew traditional wiretaps weren't enough for this secretive crew. He turned to a new weapon, nothing magical: forensic accounting. By following a paper trail of income tax returns and fraudulent lottery winnings, a team of accountant agents began to dismantle the walls surrounding the most disciplined boss in New York, Joseph the Ear Massino. Massino was a different breed of gangster, a master of counter-surveillance who even apologized to agents when he eluded them on the road. But behind his polite facade was a military-minded commander who had seized absolute power through a 1981 slaughterhouse ambush. In a deafening barrage of gunfire inside a Brooklyn club, Massino personally battered a rival capo while his Sicilian hitman finished the job. After the smoke cleared and the bodies were packaged in canvas, Massino delivered the chilling seal of approval that would haunt the family for decades: "You did a good job, Loe." The betrayal of the Bonanno family. In the world of the Cosa Nostra, blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but for the Bonanno family, a brotherhood forged in the back of a Maspeth deli was about to be drowned in a sea of betrayal. At the center of this crumbling fortress was Salvatore good-looking Sal Vitali, a man who had served as Joe Massino's most devoted acolyte since boyhood. Massino hadn't just mentored Vitali, he had married the man's sister, Josephine, weaving their fates together through family and felony. Vitali's journey from a bored corrections officer to the underboss of a crime family began behind the wheel of a Roach coach, a snack truck that doubled as a front for a massive illegal numbers racket. But the true bond was sealed in blood during the purges following the Donnie Brasco embarrassment. Massino personally justified the brutal basement execution of Capo Sonny Black Napolitano, boasting to Vitali that he had to leave a receipt for the FBI's infiltration. While bodies like Anthony Miras were being discovered with thousands of dollars stuffed into their boots, Massino and Vitali were playing a high-stakes game of cat and mouse with the FBI, using police scanners and Tommy computer to sweep their Card Avenue clubs for bugs. But even the most calculating masterminds make mistakes. When Joe Massino went on the lam to avoid the Brasco fallout, he managed to evade a federal manhunt for 2 years, only to be tripped up by a bottle of aspirin. While hiding in the Poconos under a fake alias, the man federal prosecutors called the Horatio Alger of the Mafia was caught shoplifting. He talked his way out of that petty theft, but his return to the streets signaled a new, paranoid era for the Bonannos. Massino recognized that the old mafia playbook was a death sentence. He ordered all social clubs closed and decreed that the family would no longer even bear the Bonanno name. It was now the Massino family. He stripped the romance from the induction ceremony, banning guns, knives, and burning saints, calculating that if the feds burst in, his men could simply claim they were having a friendly card game. To his troops, he became a ghost, a man whose name was never spoken. Instead, mobsters were ordered to touch their ears when referring to him, giving rise to his fitting underworld moniker, the Ear. By the 1990s, the Ear was pulling the strings of an empire while masquerading as a catering consultant for King Caterers. But while Massino was playing head games with FBI agents and making millions from Joker poker machines and cocaine networks, a new breed of investigator was following a different trail. Enter the forensic accountants. FBI agents Jeffrey Salad and Kimberly McCaffrey didn't need guns to take down the Bonannos, they needed ledgers. They tracked Vitale's money laundering through suburban banks and uncovered a mafia groupie named Barry Weinberg, a millionaire businessman so mesmerized by the mob that he let Richard Cantarella squeeze him for $800,000. When Weinberg flipped and began wearing a wire, the impenetrable fortress finally cracked. The dominoes began to fall. First Frank Coppa, the man who pioneered Wall Street scams for the mob, became the first made man in family history to flip, handing the feds an eyewitness account of Sonny Black's execution. The end came for the last Don at 6 a.m. on a cold January morning in 2003. Joe Massino was waiting for them, dressed in a black velour jogging suit and carrying no valuables, fully aware his reign was over. But the final blow was a brilliant stroke of psychological warfare. In a sterile FBI office, agents showed Sal Vitale a memo. Massino believed his underboss was a traitor and was ready to have him whacked. In that moment, the Brotherhood was dead. Vitale's defection triggered an absolute avalanche of betrayal, the domino syndrome. One by one, Massino's most loyal captains, including Frank Lino and even his teenage protege Goldie Leisenheimer, sprinted into the arms of the government. By the time the trial ended in 2004, the jury had pronounced Massino guilty of 11 counts of racketeering and murder. But the most jaw-dropping twist was yet to come. Staring down a life sentence, the man who had spent decades enforcing the code of omerta did the unthinkable. Joe Massino became the first official boss of a New York crime family to turn rat, forever cementing his legacy as the man who burned down the house he spent a lifetime building.